Hi guys, welcome to another book review. I am here with my familiar today. This is Zuki. We'll see how long he hangs out with me here. I thought it was important to show you guys my familiar. They're witches' little spirit animals, basically. And today's book review is going to be all about witches, if you can't tell from my t-shirt. And more specifically, I'm going to be talking about the Salem Witch Trials of 1692. So I found this book in Target, random buy. Happy I found it though. The author's name is Stacy Schiff, and it's called The Witches Suspicion, Betrayal, and Hysteria in 1692 Salem. If you can't tell, he really enjoys this book. Ew, you just drooled on me a little bit. It's kind of gross, but okay. Okay. So, this has always been a story in history that I have found fascinating personally. Partially because I'm just thinking, all these people were found guilty on totally imagined evidence, pretty much, right? Also, you still have all these conspiracy theories of, maybe the girls ate some magic shrooms from the woods and made them hallucinate and see their neighbors as witches, all kinds of crazy stuff. The one thing I liked about this book, really enjoyed, was that the author sets it up in a way where it's almost like an episode of Desperate Housewives is the best way I can think of it. So, if you watch that show, you remember they always did those little backstories about how an incident that happened 20 years ago became relevant again. Yeah, that's basically how she sets it up. So, for example, old family feuds, lawsuits, neighbors suing neighbors, that kind of thing. And now the person that won that lawsuit is now accused of witchcraft. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. You don't know. So it's really interesting how she ties all of that information together. And she also talks a lot about Puritan society and their religion, their culture. And there were a lot of factors that kind of contributed to the buildup and what became the witch trials, which I found really interesting because it's a lot of stuff that they really don't have time to teach you when you're in high school, when you learn American history in some aspects, right? So one of the things the Puritans routinely did was typically when children reached between 6 to 8 years of age, they sent them away from their families to live with other people in their community. So if you were a girl, you were of course learning housewifery, how to weave and cook and clean. If you were a boy, usually you were learning a trade, so blacksmithing. Maybe you were gonna go into the clergy and you were learning scripture. Like that was what they were doing, okay? So most of these girls who were accusing people of witchcraft in their community didn't live with their families. They definitely were treated like adults, okay? You didn't do this whole thing where it's like, oh, go play, that wasn't a thing. They had shit to do. They had responsibilities, okay? But she does really talk a lot about the patriarchy of the society as well, because it was interesting that you have these men in power right now listening to basically teenage girls. Very uncommon in society for that time, okay? This wasn't a situation where it's like, believe the children. This, not usually the case at all. Most of the adults are like, children are to be seen, not heard. Don't speak unless spoken to. That was typically the motto back then, okay? So the author really does do a very good job of tying a lot of these events together. She even talks about the political climate, right? So some of the villagers were saying, like, yes, they saw some of the witches and everything, but they were Indians, right, on the edge of the forest, and everyone knew that there are Indians in the forest. So for them, it wasn't a question about witchcraft. It was more like, I'm more likely to believe that, it's the Indian tribes that are going to come murder me and my family than my neighbor. So it really just depended. She also talks about Salem Village versus Salem Township, because this started in Salem Village, went over to Salem Township, and then eventually it spread to other counties. Like, it got to the point where they were accusing people who had never even come to Salem. And to the point where the sheriff was like, I'm not going to go get this person. That's like a day away. I'm not doing it. Okay? Also, a lot of the evidence that they used was all spectral. So it's all like, well, the children woke up and they saw you from their window in the field near Reverend Paris's house. Oh, I was at home asleep. Well, you're in league with the devil, so you could be in both places at once. Like, how do you defend yourself against that? You really can't. It's very difficult, okay? And that's the judges too, who were also the jury and kind of the prosecutor. So you had your accusers, and then you had the judges, who were basically trying to prosecute you because they were trying to enforce the laws, most of which were religious law, because there was no separation of church and state. That was not a thing, okay? You had to defend yourself if you were going to defend yourself, and we'll get to that in a sec, because it's a big if. No lawyer was coming to protect you in any way. You did not get a lawyer, okay? You did have the option to defend yourself if you wanted to, but it could easily backfire on you. Case in point, Bridget Bishop. So she is standing before the judges, and it is Judge Hawthorne who asks her, you stand accused of witchcraft. What do you have to say about that? And her reply was, I don't even know what a witch is. So how could I be one? And his reply is, well, if you don't know what a witch is, then how do you know you are not one? Fuck. She was found guilty and they hanged her. Yeah. So sometimes trying to defend yourself really backfired on you. And I think for me, that was like a serious oh shit moment, because even though a lot of the evidence was very superstitious or just spectral, like I saw the spirit of so-and-so, and they tortured me and stabbed me with nails or something like that. I mean, they were pretty heavy on the logic, right? And then once they bring that in, it's the people accused, it's very hard for them to get out of that, okay? Oddly enough, if you confess to being a witch, you were less likely to die. So case in point, Tituba. She was the slave of Reverend Paris. She was relatively an easy target, okay? Because she's a slave. So once she was accused of witchcraft, she just owned up to it and was like, yep, I did it, I admit it, I won't hurt the children anymore. She was the only person to not name new people. So she didn't blame anybody else other than anyone that had already been accused by this group of girls, okay? So props to her for that, because she spent well over a year in prison, which that's the other thing. If you were in prison, you were charged for, your manacles, your food, bedding, anything you needed, they charged you and you had to pay. So basically being called a witch was a very serious problem. Most of the time it led to financial ruin of families, just being ostracized from society on a whole, and being found guilty, dying, okay? Those were all very real possibilities. So being a witch was one of the worst things that you could be called, especially during this time. Because once you're accused of being a witch, you can't really disprove it, right? It's part of the problem. The author is also really good about talking about how important this incident is still to our culture as American culture, and also just how it's still relevant, which is always something that I really enjoy, because history does repeat itself. And if you're like, no, it really doesn't, well, let's talk about McCarthyism. Okay, because that happened. The worst thing that you could be called was a communist. Arthur Miller, who wrote The Crucible, which is about the Salem Witch Trials, he was called a communist. His career suffered because of that. Okay, and right now we have cancel culture. So that's another thing of like this hysteria, people, feeding into certain things or certain opinions or whatever. This has real consequences. So I think for me, this is why I find this story so fascinating, is because this does happen over and over again throughout history, just in very different ways. And the author points out some really good stuff. So The Crucible, which is about Salem Witch Trials, I read that when I was in high school. I also had to read The Scarlet Letter, which is written by Nathaniel Hawthorne with a W. The author is related to Judge Hawthorne. He added the W in the hope that he would be able to get away from this situation. So she talks about a lot of historical figures, even some of the founding fathers that had ties to the people that were involved in this situation. So it's really fascinating because it does show the repercussions of what happened afterward as well, but it also talks about how the story is still pretty relevant to our culture, our society, and it even does touch on the fact that Salem kind of had this love-hate relationship with what happened there, because even though people go there for tourism, people still don't really like to bring it up very much, depending on who they are. So this book is just really, really well written. It's so informative. I learned so much, and I honestly fell a little more in love with this kind of spooky story. And I think maybe that's what makes this story, I guess, last the test of time, is because this really did happen. And it did have a lot of these very spooky elements. If you're interested in watching a documentary about Salem Witch Trials, because reading a book is not your thing, Travel Channel and History Channel, they've made some really great ones about Salem Witch Trials. I hope that you guys would consider reading this book, though. Again, it's by Stacy Schiff, and it's called The Witches. Anyway, till next time.